Begin today the Gemara on Daf Kuf Samach Ches Amud Beis, 6 lines up from the bottom of the Yamud. Tana Rabbanan, we learned in the Braisa, Harei Sheba v'Omar. A person comes along and says, Ovad Shtar Chayvi. I lost a document of my loan. A lender, he says, I lent someone money, but I lost the document. I can't collect my loan. I can't prove that he owes me this money. So Afapi, even if Sha'omru Edim come and tell us, Onu, Kasavnu, V'chasamnu, V'nasananu loy. Yes, it's true, this person lent someone money. We wrote the shtar for him, we signed it, we gave it to him. He's not making up a story. Ein kaisvan lo yasa shtar. We're not going to write him a second document of a loan to collect his loan. Why? Because we're concerned maybe he didn't lose this document. Maybe he just hid it somewhere. And now he's going to have two documents and collect twice. Or maybe he's not, maybe he is honest, maybe he did lose it, but maybe he's going to find it later. And then once he's going to find it, he's going to be tempted to collect twice. So therefore we can't write him a second document. The Marsha, however, here does say that if it's a case where you have Edim, that he lost it somewhere in the street, where it's not expected that he'll find it again, in such a case, we will write him a second document. But if he lost it somewhere in his house, and it's possible he would find it again, so then we're afraid to write him a second shtar. Now, when is this the case? Regarding a person that says that he lost a document of a loan. If a person, a buyer that has the document of the sale, the deed, and now he comes and tells us, he says he lost the document to prove that this is his property, this is his house. Kaisvin will write him a second deed, but we're not going to write to him what's usually written into a document of a sale, which is the achrayas. The achrayas is that the seller usually takes responsibility for the sale, that if it turns out that the sale was not good, whether because the seller owed money to other people and they come and confiscate this property now from the buyer, whether it turns out that this property was never really owned by the seller stole it from someone and therefore the property is confiscated from the buyer, the seller takes responsibility to reimburse the buyer. So now that achrayis of the responsibility of reimbursement, that you can't write in this replacement shtar. As the Gemara will hear, this is going to be the main point that the Gemara is going to go through the whole entire story barichas of, we're concerned that he can now use a shtar twice if he'll find his first document, and he has now a second document. And on both of them, it says this achrayis that the seller has to reimburse him, he can utilize this twice. But if you're giving him a second document, and you're not writing that detail that the seller is going to reimburse him, so then he's just going to use it as a proof that he's the owner, but he can't use it later to go and collect from someone else to get reimbursed twice. So then it's not a problem. However, Rav Shmuel Gamliel says, Af shtore mekecho memker, even regarding a document of a sale, en kaisven. You can't write a person a second document, and even if you're doing like I just said, you're not writing him this responsibility for him to get reimbursed. And what is this based on? Because v'chein hoy Rav Shmuel Gamliel Leimer. Rav Shmuel Gamliel said as follows: Hanoisim matana lechaveiroi. If you give a person a gift, and you gave him this gift with a document that this property now belongs to you, v'hechseloi is a shtar, and the recipient of the gift returns that shtar to the giver. So then chazra matnasai. So just by returning that document that the giver gave you, that it's now yours, you give it back to the one that gave it to you. That just giving it back itself means that you're giving back the ownership to the one that gave it to you. And the same thing by a sale. If someone sells you a property with a shtar and you have the deed, if you just take that document, that deed, and you give it back to the seller, just by giving it back to him, the sale returns to him. So therefore what we're concerned over here is, you're going to write him a second document. Possibly what happened is he already gave back his first document to the seller. And now he's asking for a second document, and really it's not his anymore. He really gave it back already to the seller. I want to make a space. Okay, thank you. The Chachamim, however, the Chachamim say that when you just give back a document, it doesn't do anything. Chachamim say matnasa kayemes, that even if the buyer or the recipient gives back that document to the seller, it doesn't go back. The sale doesn't go back. The sale still remains in effect. If you want to sell what you bought back to the buyer, you're going to have to write up a new document and sell him the property back with a new shtar properly. You can't use the same shtar to return it to the seller. So according to the Chachamim, there's no concern to write him a second document. We're not concerned there about this, that maybe the first document you already gave back to the seller, because that doesn't make a difference. It's even if you gave it back to him, it's not gonna. The sale is still in effect. Oh, mamar. So the Tana here said in the Braisa that you can write a second document for a sale if the person says he lost the first one, but chutz ma'achraya shabai. You write him a second document, but you can't write that detail that the seller is taking responsibility for the buyer that he's going to reimburse him. So what's the reason for this? Why could you write him a second document? But what exactly are we concerned about if that will include also that detail that the seller has to reimburse him if it gets confiscated? So here the Gemara is going to go through all the details. I think before we see it inside, let me just paint a picture here, at least in general, what the Gemara is going to discuss here. What happens when a person buys a property? So you have Reuven that sells a property to Shimon. And now, what happens if this property gets confiscated by Shimon? From either a Bal Chayv or from someone else that comes and claims that the property never belonged to Reuven, it was a Gneve. So now Shimon has to go back to the seller, to Reuven, to get reimbursed. What happens if the seller doesn't have any properties to reimburse him? Because any other properties that he owned, he later sold to another buyer afterwards. Levi, Yehuda, bought another 2 properties from this seller later on. So then he's going to go to those other buyers later on to get reimbursed from them. He's going to say to them, I bought a property from this seller before you, and he took responsibility that he's going to reimburse me. So it's the seller's responsibility with these karka, with these lands that you bought from him later on to reimburse me. So he goes to the next buyer to get reimbursed. Now what happens with the second buyer? That now the second buyer's property just got confiscated by the first buyer that was looking to get reimbursed. So now the second buyer has to go back to the seller and also say to him, you sold me a property, you took responsibility, reimburse me. How does the second buyer, with what koyach does the second buyer go to the seller? When the first buyer wants to get reimbursed, so the shtar that he has, that he is an owner of this property that he bought, he goes to the second buyer. He gives the second buyer that shtar. He says, I don't have this property anymore. It was confiscated from me. So the shtar that he had, that he's the owner, he gives it to the second buyer, and the second buyer takes that shtar and shows the seller, look, I have the shtar from the first buyer that came to me and confiscated my karka. So now you have to reimburse me as well. The second buyer now has to be reimbursed as well. That's usually the way it works. Okay, so now what over here, if the first buyer is going to have 2 shtaris that he bought a property from the seller, he's going to be able to go and try to get reimbursed for a property that got confiscated from him twice. And the Gemara is going to explain how that will work. So the Gemara, so my time, why is there a problem for a buyer to have 2 documents for his ownership, and 2 documents that say in it that he has to get reimbursed if it gets confiscated from him? So why is that a problem? Amir Rav Safra said, you can't write 2 documents of ownership on one property because dilme, perhaps what will happen is as follows. Ozil balchoiv, a balchoiv of the seller, a blender of the seller will come and and he will come to confiscate this property from the first buyer. And so now this person is going to come and take out the first shtar that he has. So now this owner, if he has 2 shtaris, the first buyer, if he has 2 shtaris, proving the ownership of his karka, so he's going to take out the first shtar, and is going to go to the second buyer to get reimbursed for this karka that was taken away from him by the Bal Chayv. Now, Bal Chayv, he's going to tell this Bal Chayv that came to confiscate his property, I want to play over this game a second time. I have a second document that will give me the right to confiscate another property a second time. But he doesn't want to do it immediately. The Gemara is soon going to spell it out. If this person is going to try to use the document of ownership that he has a second time to confiscate a second time, so then people are going to see you just confiscated a property for a loan, you're coming now a second time to get reimbursed for the same property a second time. So what does he do? So he tells the Bal Chayv that's confiscating his property, again, this is the first buyer that's saying to the Bal Chayv, Shufli, be quiet with me. We'll do this together. This is what Rashbam calls us a knunya. They're conspiring together. Let's be quiet about this. The Eikimba, and I'll sit here in this property for another couple of years. And then v'hoda ta tirfon, then come again into the Bezdin to confiscate my property a second time. And now I'll take out my second document of ownership that I have on this property that you're taking away from me. And then he's going to go and confiscate from a buyer another time. The first time around, he confiscated from a second buyer, and the second time around, he's going to confiscate from a third buyer of this seller. So he's waiting in between, and he's going to confiscate a second time. That's the problem that we have if you give a person, the first buyer in this case, you give him two documents which have in it the responsibility of reimbursement. So now he's going to use it out to get reimbursed twice.
That means Bezdin forgot that he...
Yeah, correct. He's waiting, the Rashbamir says he waits 4 or 5 years, and he probably goes to a different Bezdin in an opposite side of town, and people forgot, and so therefore he can go ahead and do this. So the Gemara will address. 1 second, let's see. So the Gemara asks, wait a minute, how could a Baal Chayv come into the Bezdin to confiscate this property of this first buyer 2 times? He has to walk into Bezdin with a shtar that he's coming to confiscate his property. So, but how could he walk into Bezdin and do this twice? Like the Gemara, the Baal Chayv has 1 shtar that he's owed money. The Kiv, but what happens to that first shtar? The Gemara here asks, the Kiv in the Karane l'shtar the Malve, but l'chayre, after the first time that the lender came to confiscate this property from this buyer, we tear his shtar now. We tear the shtar of the loan. So how could he play along with the first buyer now to come back 4 or 5 years later to come to Bezdin, here I have a shtar, this guy owes me money, and to confiscate the property a second time? He doesn't have a shtar a second time to do this again. Now, if you'll argue and say, the case is that the Bezdin did not tear that document of the loan the first time, so he still has it, so he can do this a second time. But the Gemara says that's not possible, because Rav Nachman said, Kol tirfe, okay, so there's a certain say there of how Bezdin goes about allowing a lender to confiscate someone's property. You can't just walk into Bezdin and right away he comes and confiscates a property. The Rashbam here goes through the whole say there. Usually when a lender comes to collect money, so Bezdin has to send a hazmana, an invitation of a dentator to the loive, to the borrower. And then if he doesn't pay or if he doesn't want to come, so then Bezdin will write a shtar tirfil malva, which means that if the borrower is not paying, so Bezdin will give the malva a document from Bezdin, which gives him the right to go to search by the properties of the borrower to see which property he could confiscate from him. So now, but every time Bezdin gives a shtar tirfa, once Bezdin gets to that point that they're giving the lender this document that he can go and search the properties of the borrower, what they do is, they now tear that original document of the loan that the lender had. And if they don't tear it, lav tirfuhu. So then this document that they're giving him now to go and search his properties, it's not a good start because he still has that original document of the loan that he can use a second time. So Bezdin always tears that shtar of the loan after they already gave him a new shtar which gives him the right to search the properties of the borrower. And then there's the next stage. After that, after he searches the properties of the borrower and he finds the property that he wants to possess, so then there's what's called an adrachte. An adrachte is the right that Bezdin gives this lender to take hold, to occupy this property of the borrower. So when Bezdin writes that shtar, which is called an adrachte, that he has right to possess this property, the loikosav bay, karane letirfe, if it's not written in it that we only gave him this document to possess this property, we already tore the previous document, which gives him the right to go and search in his properties, lav adrachtehu. This shtar is not a good shtar adrachte. We always have to tear the stage before, the document that Bezdin writes, Bezdin has to tear it, and they have to write into this shtar adrachte that we tore it. Mm-hmm. And then furthermore, what's the next stage? V'chol shuma v'loy kasabei karan ala drachte. Then, when he takes possession of this property, if Bezdin has to now evaluate this property, what's exactly its value, to know how much he can take from it for the payment of his loan. So when Bezdin writes him a shtar of a shuma for the evaluation of this property, so then, if they didn't write into it, again, v'chol shumud leiksiv bekaran ala adrachte lav shumi. So then this document that he now has for the evaluation of the Bezdin for this property, it's not a good document if they didn't first tear the previous shtar that gave him the right to possess it. So we see here, Bezdin is very careful about this. Bezdin never wants a person to use a shtar that he doesn't need anymore a second time. So every stage they tear the shtar before. So over here, the document of the loan is already torn. So how would this person come and collect a second time? That says the Gemara. So the concern here is taken a different case. The concern is not about a case of a loan. We only need this. When is there a concern here? What happened is the first buyer here who's confiscating his property, not a balchayv, not a loan. Somebody came to you and to the buyer and says, your seller, he's a ganav. He stole it from my father. And he brings Adam for this. He brings Adam that this property belonged to his father. So he's a gazlan. That's how he's confiscating the property. So in such a case, what the Gemara said before, that they could conspire together to now replay this whole game a second time 4 years later. So he says to this person, I understand this person stole the property from you, but we'll split the profit over here. We'll do this a second time. 4 or 5 years from now, you'll come back to Bezdin, a different Bezdin, and you'll bring the same Adam again. And I have two documents that I'm the buyer of this property, and I'll be able to confiscate from 2 buyers later twice. So therefore, we don't want to give him 2 documents to collect twice. That's what we're concerned about. So Ravachim Avdifti asks Ravina about one detail here of the story. Why would he have to tell this balchayv, or now we're saying that it's really this person that's saying that this property was really stolen from his father? Why does he have to say to him, Shufli b'hayare, that here, I'm confiscating your property, but now he says to him, let's wait another couple of years, and let's be quiet about this, and I'll sit in this property, and ve'ekimba, I'll live in it, and then later on, I'll do the same thing again. V'teipiklei, and I'll take it out again. A second time to confiscate the property a second time. The kivin the noke trei shtori, but sorry, I think this is how you read it. Teipiklei, why don't we simply say he doesn't have to wait? The kivin the noke trei shtori, tarif ahad tarif. If he has 2 documents which gives him the right to get reimbursed twice, so then he'll do it right away twice. Why does he have to wait between one time and the second time? He'll just do it right away. So I already explained this before. So the Gemara says, if you're going to do it right away, so then you're going to have 2 balidinim. He's coming to confiscate from 2 people at the same time, or one day after the other. They're going to hear about this. They're going to talk to each other. They're going to figure out this guy is confiscating twice. He's getting reimbursed for the same property twice. What happened over here? So therefore, he's waiting a couple of years. Goes maybe to a different bezdin. So then he's able to do this. Okay. So therefore, what's the conclusion of all this? You can't give an owner of a property a document that gives him the right to get reimbursed twice. But there's a different eitzah here. There's another way to prevent this problem. Give him a good star. The guy says he lost his star. Give him a good star that says that he could get reimbursed, but there's still a way to prevent him of getting reimbursed twice. How is that? Give this buyer a perfect star that gives him the right to get reimbursed. But write for the seller the following receipt. Write to him a star that says, Kol shtara, the yapkan al areda psulin, any document of proof for ownership on this property that will ever be brought to the Bezdin is pasul, is not accepted. Levar midiyepuk bezimnedah. Besides this new star that we're writing now with the new date. So and the meicher, the seller, has that receipt. So if you're going to want to come and present that other star that you have from before that you claim you lost, or maybe you did and now you found, and you want to go get reimbursed twice, the seller is always going to have this receipt that says that you could only use this new star. The old star is null and void. So why can't we do that? Just give him this receipt. Says the Gemara, Amru Rabbana Kamei Rav Papa, V'Amrillah Kamei Rav Ashi. So the Rabbanan in front of Rav Papa, or others say in front of Rav Ashi, they said, based on what we're saying here, that we don't take this option. Zoyse Meres. What this Braisa teaches us is Ein Kais V'Shoiver, that we don't write receipts. This is actually something that comes up in the next blot. The Gemara discusses B'chlal, then you get to a case of a buyer and a seller, or regarding loans as well. When a person gets paid up a loan, do you write a receipt, or do you take that document of a loan and tear it up? So according to one opinion, it says that we don't write a receipt, because writing a receipt has a downside to it. The person that's getting the receipt always has to be careful with that receipt to make sure that it doesn't get lost. Mm-hmm. So he says, I'm not interested in constantly making sure that I have this receipt. I'm going to tear up the document of your loans. Like this, I know that you can never collect from me a second time. Why should I leave you the document of the loan and I have to always hold on to the receipt? We're going to tear it up. So over here as well, in this case, we're going to give the seller a receipt, and because this buyer was a shlemazel and he lost his document of his property, so now he wants us to write him a second document, and he's saying, you're concerned that the buyer is concerned that I'm going to collect the second time. Let him have a receipt. So the buyer, the seller that it says, you're a shlemazel and I should have to hold on to a receipt all the time. I don't want any receipt. If you want, I'll give you a second document which will not give you any right to get reimbursed. That I can give you, but I'm not going to have to hold on to a receipt. That's what we see from here. But this is a machlokes actually, whether we write a receipt or not. So from here, from this brayso, we see that we don't write a receipt. Okay, but to this, Amalahu, Rav Papa or Rav Ashi answered back to the Rabbana that said that this brayso proves that you don't write a receipt, and they said, no, our case is different. Pa'alme, in other cases, regarding a case of a loan, once a person already collected his loan over there, we don't write a receipt. Over there, in another case, I could say that you do write a receipt for the borrower, that he already paid up the loan. But haina time over here, in our case, the reason why we're not going to write a receipt for the seller is because maybe giving this receipt to the seller is not going to help us. What's the story over here again? You have the first buyer that his property gets confiscated, and if he wants to get reimbursed, if the seller doesn't have any properties in his possession anymore, who does the first buyer go to? To a second buyer, and then theoretically he can go to a third buyer if he has two documents. He'll go. So he's going to other buyers to get reimbursed. He's never going back to the seller. Giving the seller the receipt is not going to help you. Says the Gemara, the Dilma Azul Balchayv, V'tarev Minei Delekeyach. A Balchayv comes and confiscates his property from the first buyer, and then V'azul Iyu, the first buyer goes V'tarev Lekuchais, and he goes and he wants to get reimbursed from the buyers that bought properties from this seller afterwards. And these buyers don't have any receipt to know that he already got reimbursed once, and you're not allowed to use a second document. Who has that receipt? The seller has it. So there's no use in giving the receipt to the seller. But the Gemara asks, why is there no use? What's going to happen in such a case? Sof, in the end of the day, what's going to happen is, what happens when the first buyer goes to the second buyer to get reimbursed? Who does the second buyer go to? The second buyer goes back to the original seller to tell him what happened over here, that the property is getting confiscated from me, and he goes back to the original buyer, to the original seller, that is, the seller, and then asks him, what's going on? This property is getting confiscated from me. You should be the one that has to reimburse him. Who has to reimburse him? The second buyer? No. The seller has to reimburse him. If the seller has no money in his possession, so then you go to the second buyer, or you can maybe even go to a third buyer. If he has a second shtar, he'll do this. But the lekuchais, lav amare the arahadri, the second buyer or third buyer, you're concerned that they don't have the receipt, but won't they go back to the seller and find that from the seller? Are you going to reimburse them? Says the Gemara, yeah, true, they could go back they will eventually go back to the original, to the seller to get reimbursed for the properties that are going to be confiscated from them, but ad the hachi, in between, shamit v'achal peri. In between, this person is going to get reimbursed by the second buyer, the third buyer, and in between, he's going to eat the paytis. Then later on, they're going to go back to the seller. They're going to find out that really there was only one shtar that was supposed to be used, because the seller has that receipt, but in between this person ate from these paytis, and now to get the paytis back that he ate from you is already going to be a whole fight. So it's going to be a hassle. It's difficult. Okay, so this is the Rishonim here talk about this. Let's say this is a case where the seller is out of town. So when the first buyer wants to get reimbursed, who's he going to? He's not going back to the seller. The seller's not here b'chlal anymore. He left town. So therefore, he's going to get reimbursed by the second buyer, by the third buyer. But then eventually, the second buyer and the third buyer are going to find the seller. They're going to, when he comes back to town, they're going to go and get reimbursed by him. By the time that happens, and they figure out that this guy is a ganev, that he stole the property from them because he already got reimbursed once, and he's now coming to get reimbursed a second time. It's already been a couple of years, and this person has been eating paytis, and now to go and fight with him, take him on the Torah, and to bring him to get back the paytis that he was using from this property is going to be a big hassle. So that's why using a eitzah of giving a receipt is not a viable idea. Hinami, or another case where this won't work, to give a receipt to the seller that he could only use one document and not a second one. If it's a case where there's a second or third buyer that bought later that you want to get reimbursed from them, and that buyer later bought their property without any responsibility of the seller to reimburse him. So if you're going to go into that buyer to want to get reimbursed, that buyer is never going back to the seller, because the seller has no responsibility to reimburse them for this property. That was the deal of that sale. So in a case where there's no achrayus, so they're never going back to the seller. So what's the point of giving this receipt to the seller if you can go to the buyer and the buyer's never going to go back to the seller? Now, if that's what you're concerned about over here, regarding this case, a property owner that is going to have two documents to prove his ownership, and he's going to try to get reimbursed twice. So, if that's the case, shtari halva nami, by a star of a loan, we should have the same exact concern. What did we say that by a loan over there? We do write a receipt, right? That's how this whole answer over here, the Gemara said. But really by a loan, once a person used a document to get to go and confiscate a property for his loan once, so then we are going to write a receipt for the person that he confiscated the property from, and we're not concerned about the fact that he's going to use it a second time to go and collect from it. Why? Because there's a receipt. But over here, by the properties, when a person has a proof of ownership of the property, here we're concerned that he's going to use it a second time. But the Gemara asks, by shtara halva nami, why don't we say the same exact thing by a document of a loan? After the person collected with this document of the loan one time, you're giving a receipt to the first person that he confiscated from. How is that going to help you for him not being able to go to another buyer later to go and confiscate a second time? They don't have that receipt. You're not giving them the receipt. So why shouldn't he be able to come and confiscate a second time? And answers the Gemara, Hassam over there, by a loan, the Zuzi Masik. By a loan, the person is coming to collect money, right? So if you give a person, so therefore, Omri Paise Balchoiv Bezuzi. If you want to come and collect a second time by a loan, if you want to come and collect a second time a loan. So the reason why a receipt is going to help is because if you come to another buyer to go and confiscate your property because of this loan that's owed to you a second time, so because it's money that's owed to you, what happens usually by a loan? By a loan, how's the person paid back a loan? Usually a loan you paid back with cash. You borrowed money and you expected to get paid back with cash. If the borrower that is, does not have cash, what happens? So then you take the properties that he has, and if he doesn't have properties anymore, so you go to the buyers of the borrower. But originally, how's a person usually paid for a loan? A person is usually paid with cash. So therefore, that's the case. So when the Balchoiv will want to come a second time because he never gave up his document of the loan, he only gave a receipt to the lender, but he never gave up his original document. If he wants to come to collect a second time, so Omri Paise Balchoiv Bezuzi. So what's going to happen is the buyers are going to say, why are we giving this lender this property for the loan? Usually a loan is supposed to be paid with money. So they're going to wait to go back to the borrower, which is their seller, and ask him, do you have money to pay back this loan? Here we have this, your Balchoiv is coming to collect our property. Do you have money to pay him? They're probably going to go back to the borrower to find out if he has money or not. And then what's going to happen when they go back to the borrower and ask him if he has money? They're going to find out that this loan was paid up already, and because he has a receipt that he paid up already. So even though the buyers don't have the receipt, but they usually go back to the seller, which is the borrower, and they'll find out that there's a receipt there. But over here, when we're talking about a property that a person bought, and now this property was confiscated from him, the Ara Masik, that this person is coming to get reimbursed for a property that got confiscated from him, made the Yediyah, the Mandamasik Ara Bezuzi Loi Mefayis. The buyers here know that usually when a person gets a property confiscated from him, what does he want? He's not interested in getting cash as a reimbursement for this. He bought a property from the seller, so when he wants to get reimbursed, he wants the seller to reimburse him with another property. He's not a balchoiv that's looking to get a payment for a loan. He wants to get reimbursed with a property. So over here, what's very possible that could happen is he's going to go to the second or third buyer to get reimbursed for the property that was confiscated from him, and the second or the third buyer is never going to bother to go back to the original seller to find out whether he's reimbursing them with cash, because this is not a kind of a case that you usually reimburse with cash. This is usually a case that you reimburse with an actual property. It was a property that was confiscated from you, and now you want to get reimbursed with the property. So in such a case, giving a receipt to the seller is not useful for these buyers here that you're going to confiscate from them. So therefore, in such a case, writing a receipt is not going to work. But by a loan, when a person wants to collect a loan a second time, because a loan is usually paid back in cash, over here, if you're going to try to confiscate from a buyer, those buyers are going to first go back to the borrower, which is their seller, and ask them, are you paying back in cash or not? And then the receipt is useful. They're going to find out that he already paid and he has a receipt for this. Talk to Gemara Omar Mar. Okay, now going back to another detail that it said in the Braise. When you write a second document for a buyer, so what do you write? You write this new document, but chutz min achraya shabai, besides the right to be able to get reimbursed. So heiche kisvina. So what do you write? What kind of a star when you write this replacement star? What exactly do you write? Rav Nachman says t'chsivi hachi. What you write is as follows: Shtara dinon. This star that we're writing, Deloy lemigbi bay. You cannot use it to get reimbursed with it. Loy mishabdi, not from any properties that the seller already sold off. Not even from any properties that the seller still has in his possession. You cannot get reimbursed with this document at all. Ella, so what's the point of having this document? You can just use it as proof that he bought this property. If the seller ever wants to come and claim, I never sold you this property, he has proof that it was sold to him. But if it gets confiscated from him, he can never use this document to get reimbursed. So Rafram said, based on the way Rav Nachman describes this, so based on what you're saying, we can understand that achrayis ta seiferu, that any document of a sale or of a loan that you write and you don't include in it explicitly that the seller takes responsibility to reimburse if it gets confiscated, even if you don't write it explicitly, it's a mistake. Because even without writing it, it's going to be self-understood that that's included. Right, so, and why? How do we see that? Because time, the cost of lehachi. Rav Nachman said the only reason why now you can't use this document to go and get reimbursed is because you explicitly write that you're not going to get reimbursed. Oh, cost of lehachi. But if it's a plain document that doesn't say anything, it just says that you bought this property and it doesn't say that you could or cannot get reimbursed, so then Gavi, you are able to get reimbursed. So I see that any document of a sale, you don't have to spell out specifically that you can get reimbursed. Even if you don't, it's just going to be considered to be a mistake, an omission of the scribe, but really you have the right to get reimbursed. However, Rav Ashi argues, Rav Ashi says, no, achrayis lav ta seiferu. If you don't write clearly in a document that you're not giving the buyer the right to get reimbursed, it's not a mistake. That means that he does not get that right. Now, when the Braise says that you're giving this person a replacement document and you're not writing in it the right that he has to get reimbursed, what that means is the lekasa be'achrayis. You give him a document and you don't write that added line that he has the right to get reimbursed. So if you don't write it explicitly, he cannot get reimbursed for this. So the Gemara brings an incident that happened in connection to this machlekes here. There was this woman, the Yavel Ezuzelaho Gavra. She gave money to a certain individual, a shliach that she appointed, lemizbon la'ara, to go and buy a piece of land for her. Azal, the shliach went, Zavon, he bought her a property, but shaloi b'achrayis. He bought her this property, but the seller sold the property without any responsibility for the ownership of this karka. That if it gets confiscated from you, I take no responsibility for this. So now this woman felt like the shliach didn't do his shlichus properly. I tell you to buy a property, and you buy me a property without this guarantee. So what happens now if anyone claims that this property belongs to them? I'm never going to get reimbursed. It's not, you didn't do your shlichus properly. So Asila Kamed Rav Nachman. So this woman came in front of Rav Nachman. Omar Leis, Rav Nachman said to this shliach, the woman sent you to buy a property to buy a property properly, but not to buy a property in such a way that now she has nothing from this if it gets confiscated from her. And therefore, Rav Nachman said, Zil Zavna Minei Shaloi Bachrayis, you now have to go and you're going to be the buyer from this seller that sold it to you without any responsibility. So you have to take that sale for yourself. And now you sell it back to this woman that sent you to do this, to buy this property for her. So you will take responsibility that if it gets confiscated, you're going to reimburse her. So this shliach is going to have to take responsibility for the mistake that he made on himself. Going back to the Braise before, it said, Rav Shimon ben Gamliel said, when a person gives a gift for his friend, the hechsaloi is a star, another buyer or the recipient of the gift just returns that same document that he got for this sale or for this gift. He returns that very same document back to the giver or the seller. Chazra matanosei. So the gift goes back to that person. However, Chachamim say, no, matnasa kayemes. The matana stays in effect. If you want to give it back to the seller or to the giver, you're going to have to write up a new document and make a new kinyan here. So the Gemara explains, my time with Rab Shimon Gamliel, what's the explanation of Rab Shimon Gamliel? Why can you take the same document and give it back to the giver? Why don't you have to make a new sale? Amar Ravasi, so Ravasi says, because when you give a person a document for a gift, it's as if the giver is saying to him, this property is given to you as a gift, as long as you have this document in your hands. But if you don't have this document, then it's not yours anymore. So therefore, if he gives back the document to the giver, so then it goes back to him. Maskefla Rabba asked him what Ravasi said. How could you say that this is what it is? That it's like such a kind of condition? If that's the case, Nigna Vayavad Nami, if this document that the recipient has of this property, if it got stolen or it got lost, are you also going to say that now he loses his ownership because he doesn't have a document anymore in his hands? How could you say that this is a condition, that only if he has the document in his hands, it's his, and if not, not? So Elam Rabbe, so therefore Rabbe says the argument here between Rab Shimon Gamliel and the Chachamim is something else. But Oisius niknais b'mesire kamiflagi. Oisius, which refers to a star. When you have words that are written on a star, can you acquire this just by mesire? This is what their argument is. This is an argument that was brought up earlier in the Masechta. And this is an argument regarding a case where a person has a star of ownership on a property. So what happens if this person that has this star gives the star to someone else? So what is he giving him? Is he giving him a piece of paper? He's not just giving him a piece of paper. The piece of paper has in it the information about the ownership of this karka, of this land that he owns. So if you give this star to someone else, will that be effective that he now is going to acquire not just a piece of paper, but he's also going to acquire the actual information that's in this star, which is the ownership of the karka? Could you just give over the star itself, and that creates the kinyan for the entire karka? Or no? And if you want to sell a karka to someone else, you can't just give him the shtar. You have to actually make a proper sale to sell him that karka. That's the argument here. So Rab Shimon Gamliel says, Oisius niknais b'mesire, that when you give someone a shtar, so because the shtar has the information of the ownership, just by giving over the shtar, you can sell a property to someone else that way. So in our case as well, if you want to sell it back to the seller, so the buyer gives that shtar back to the seller, so then it goes back to him, just by giving him the shtar. You don't have to make a new kinyan. If you want to sell a property to someone, you can't just give him the deed of the property into his hands, and then the sale is in effect. You're going to have to make a proper kinyan. You have to make a new kinyan on the karka. So over here as well, if the buyer wants to give this karka back to the seller, you can't just give him back the shtar. You have to make a new proper kinyan on the karka in order for the kinyan to take effect.